Hi, this is Andre Fabiani, and for my final project I chose the country of Venezuela. The reason I chose this country is because my family has close ties and history with the country. My father's family migrated from Italy to Venezuela in 1958, starting with my father's brother, then my grandparents, my father's sister, and then finally my father in 1960. They lived and worked there for 3 years for a mining and trucking company. Most of what they did for work was supporting an American company, working jobs in cafe restaurants, and anything for American workers. My uncle was a barber, and my grandfather was a truck driver. Then, in search of better opportunities, my father decided to migrate to America in 1963, which is where he has been ever since. My uncle, however, stayed there in Venezuela for the next 50 years. He worked in a large trucking company that supplied trucks and equipment of the mining companies. The company was located in a small city called Puerto Ordaz, just outside the bigger city of Guayana City, which is a city deep in Venezuela along the Orinoco River and on the edge of the massive southern jungle. It is about an 8-hour car ride to Caracas, but back then was a lot longer because the roads were still dirt and not maintained. This is why I chose this country. I feel I have a connection with it and was able to use my father and my uncle, that are now 83 and 85 years old, as primary resources for some of the information and experiences they had. What role did your nation play during the Cold War? Well, politicians in Venezuela have always been torn on where they are in politics. They had to try to balance between keeping their neighboring countries happy, keeping the US happy, and had always had close relations with Cuba and the Soviets. The rivalries between the US and Cuba only made things more complicated for Venezuela that threatened the stability on this side of the world. During the Cold War years, Venezuela was in search of preserving democracy and tried to achieve economic prosperity through many riches and the rich resources of the land. They struggled for political peace and was heavily tested by radicals on both sides of the spectrum, and there were several attempts to unseat President Betancourt in 1958 and 1960. The dictator from the Dominican Republic financed an attempt to detonate a bomb near the presidential motor car that killed the driver but only wounded the president. The U.S. was suspected in being involved in that and caused Venezuela to be on high alert and did not trust the U.S. and surrounding nations. Once the leftists succeeded the extreme right, the Venezuelan Communist Party joined the movement of the revolutionary left, where they attempted two failed military uprisings in 1962. This moved into guerrilla warfare, where the discovery of Cuban weapons in Venezuela in 1963 and the successful landings of Venezuelan guerrillas with some Cuban troops that invaded Tucacas in 1966. As Venezuela continued to build relations with Cuba, which of course was building relations with the Communist Soviet Union, it only heightened the threat to the U.S. and put more fear in Americans during the Cold War. The threat of the Soviets not only having alliance with Cuba, but if they had alliance with Venezuela, that also could have been a turning point on the war on communism. What ways your country affected by imperialism and decolonization? In 1911, Venezuela declared its independence from Spanish colonialism and established the Republic of Venezuela. After independence of Venezuela, they went through years and years of unrest with wars and changes of power, with overthrown governments and dictators. In 1954, the Guatemalan president Arbenz was overthrown in a CIA-backed coup. 1961, the U.S. backed the Bay of Pigs invasion that failed to overthrow Cuban leader Fidel Castro, but Washington continued to launch attempts to assassinate Castro and dislodge his government. This would have caused fear and mistrust of the U.S. to Venezuela, and it only continued. Leftist President Goulart of Brazil was overthrown in a U.S.-backed coup that installed military government lasting until the 1980s. U.S. forces landed in Dominican Republic to intervene with a civil war. In the 70s, Argentina, Chile, and allied South American nations launched a brutal campaign called Operation Condor with the U.S. support. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan administration backed anti-communist Contra forces against Nicaragua, and U.S. forces invade Caribbean island of Grenada after accusing the government of allying itself with communist Cuba. And in 1989, U.S. invades Panama to oust Manuel Noriega. The U.S. had a lot of involvement with South American countries and their regimes, all contributing to Venezuela's unsettlement of U.S. interference. How has the country been impacted by globalization? The Venezuelan experience is quite the opposite of the current plans of globalization and minimizes the role of the nation, specifically in its undeveloped country. As we have seen, Chavez's goal from the beginning was to achieve power at the national level. The words globalization of Venezuela and Venezuela do not mix well, especially if you were speaking to Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez or Maduro today. They have been fighting an upward battle against forces of globalization. Venezuela's stance against globalization can be seen in Chavez's policies and throughout the Venezuelan economy. The nation of Venezuela has taken a firm stance against globalization. President Hugo Chavez made it clear that globalization is a Western idea that needs to be avoided, and they did not want to be a part of it. While they did allow international trade, the average goods imported are heavily taxed, at least 12%. The country's goals are to keep as much at home as possible. Their policies have been designed to share the wealth between all people in the country. For example, the people that have received free housing, subsidized food from the government, and land stripped from others, and social welfare. While Venezuela's future is blurry, it appears that as long as these type of regimes like Maduro stay in power, the Venezuelan government will be determined to stand against the forces of globalization. Number 4 and number 5 was to what degree has your country modernized in the post-1945 world, and what are the biggest challenges that your country faces in 2019? So, this country has struggled for political power for decades. Prior to being president, Colonel Hugo Chavez and his supporter made several attempts to overthrow the government, with hundreds of people being killed and eventually Chavez being jailed for 2 years. After the release of Chavez, the President Perez was impeached for corruption charges. That began the rise of Hugo Chavez. By 1998, Chavez was elected president and launched a revolution to bring new constitution supporting socialist economics, social policies, all funded by high oil prices and anti-U.S. foreign policies. Then he began the redistribution of land and wealth. In 2002, armed forces rebel in Venezuela. There's a violent standoff. The president is taken into military custody. However, the interim government leader collapses and Chavez returns to office. Chavez continues with his policies and signs bills to reform and eliminate large land estates and farms from the people. Ranchers protest this as an attack on their private property and rights. He created new media regulations that give stiff fines and prison sentences for slandering public figures. By 2005, parties loyal to President Chavez dominate parliament after the opposing parties boycotting the elections. Chavez creates an alliance with his close friend Fidel Castro and with Russia, with a $3 billion deal including buying jet fighters, helicopters, and working away from U.S. arms supplies. In 2006, Hugo Chavez wins his third term in presidential elections with 63% of the vote. Chavez announces key energy and telecommunication companies will be nationalized by Parliament. Two leading U.S. oil companies, ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, refused to hand over the majority of control to their operations to the Venezuelan government, which they just take possession of them. President Chavez suffers his first defeat at the ballot box when a vote narrowly rejects proposals to increase government control over the Central Bank of Venezuela and the power to expropriate property. But in 2008, an important event happens when Venezuela and Russia sign an oil and gas cooperation bill. Russian warplanes visit Venezuela, with Russian warships heading there for joint exercises, first return of the Russian Navy since the Cold War in the Americas. Voters in a referendum approve plans to abolish limits on the number of terms and of office an elected official can have. This allows President Chavez to stand again when his term expires in 2012. In 2012, President Chavez wins his fourth term in office, but shortly after dies in 2013. Nicolas Maduro his chosen successor is elected president by a narrow margin, and opposition contests the results. The violence and corruptness just continue when anti-government protests outbreak and people are killed in the streets. The Democratic Unity Coalition wins two-thirds majority in parliamentary elections, ending the 16 years of the Socialist Party control. In 2016, hundreds of thousands of people take part in a protest in Caracas calling for the removal of President Maduro, accusing him of responsibility for the economic crisis. Opposition contests the official victory of President Maduro at presidential elections. The UN says 2 million Venezuelans have fled abroad to neighboring countries since 2014. Currently today, the opposition leader Juan Guaido declares himself interim president, appeals to military to oust President Maduro on the grounds that the election was rigged. European Union, United States, and most Latin American countries recognize Mr. Guaido. Violence continues to erupt in the country, and especially in Venezuela-Colombian border, over the delivery of humanitarian aids to Venezuela. The U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned Venezuelan President Maduro that his days are numbered, and Trump officials reiterated that the U.S. is considering all options, including military action, to address the crisis in Venezuela. Standing on the balcony of his presidential palace, Maduro warned his people about the U.S., telling them, "We don't want to go back to gringo interventions of the 20th century," he said. "The U.S. is trying to mount a coup and install a puppet government to protect its interests in Venezuela." Almost 80% of Venezuelans disapprove of Maduro. When he was re-inaugurated for his second six-year term in January after an election widely seen as fraudulent, since taking power in 2013, he has led Venezuela into a deep economic crisis. The U.S., among more than a dozen countries, including UK, Canada, and most of Venezuela's neighbors, that have so far recognized the 35-year-old Guaido as interim president. Maduro has announced that he was breaking off ties with the U.S. and ordered all diplomats to leave within 72 hours. Again, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo replied that the socialist leader has no legal authority to give that order as a former president. Instead of withdrawing the mission, Pompeo pledged to give $20 million in humanitarian aid for Guaido and his people to hand out. Venezuela is in an economic freefall. As a result of government-led mismanagement and corruption, along with the choices Maduro makes, has led to a humanitarian crisis. Basic food, medicines for Venezuela's approximately 30 million citizens is becoming a major issue in the country. It's been devastating to the healthcare system and has caused outbreaks of treatable diseases and rising death rates. The future of the country is very unstable, and we have no idea where it is headed. The UN involvement is causing higher tensions in the nation, and I am hoping that they can avoid an all-out war to overthrow Maduro, but rather have a peaceful ousting and transition to Guaido. In conclusion, around the time of 2013, after the death of Hugo Chavez, my uncle that had established him and his family's life for decades found themselves in a very unstable economy. Small revolutions, protests, and violence started to break out in the cities, and Maduro's new government started taking people's properties and redistributing wealth. A lot of companies forcibly taken over by the government and people started fleeing the country into nearby countries. Once my uncle and cousins had nothing else left and saw the writings on the wall, they also jumped ship ahead of time and got safe passage to the U.S. in the Miami area, where they are today, and where there are thousands of Venezuelans that fled. After seeing what is going on today, they were very fortunate to have got out when they did. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and good luck to all of you in your futures. Thank you.